The sun hung low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement of River's Edge, a small, forgotten town in the deep south. Its main street was flanked by rows of weathered brick buildings, their peeling paint whispering stories of better days. The air was thick with the mingling scents of fried food, motor oil, and the faint musk of the nearby bayou. It was a place where time seemed to stagnate, where old traditions lingered and change was met with hostility. At the center of this uneasy calm stood Marcus and Malik Carter, twin brothers with a bond forged not only by blood, but by battles most people couldn't fathom. Tall, broad-shouldered, and unmistakably confident in their stride, they carried themselves like men who had faced the impossible and won. Their matching brown eyes held a sharpness, a quiet intensity that hinted at secrets few could comprehend. They had returned to their hometown after years away, hoping for a brief reprieve, a chance to reconnect with the place they once called home. But as they walked down the dusty main street, it was clear they were no longer seen as the boys who used to toss footballs in the schoolyard or help their grandmother carry groceries. Hushed whispers followed them. "Did you see who just walked in?" a voice hissed from inside the diner. "It's the Carter boys," another replied, barely concealed behind the smudged window. "Can't believe they came back here of all places." The brothers exchanged a glance. Marcus, the older of the two by a mere 3 minutes, smirked as if to say, "Same old town." Malik, ever the quieter one, tugged his hoodie tighter around his frame, his sharp jaw clenched. They stepped into the corner store, a cramped space lined with sagging shelves stocked with canned goods, chips, and the occasional handmade trinket. The bell above the door gave a sharp jingle as they entered, and the conversation at the counter came to an abrupt halt. Behind the register, an older man in a plaid shirt froze mid-sentence, his gaze locking onto the twins with a mix of discomfort and disdain. Standing beside him was a group of 4 younger men, each wearing leather jackets adorned with a distinctive patch, a coiled snake wrapped around a Confederate flag. The local gang, the Copperheads. Marcus and Malik didn't need introductions. They'd grown up knowing these kinds of men, small-town bullies who thrived on intimidation. Malik's eyes darted to the leader, a wiry man with a scruffy beard and a cigarette dangling from his lips. His name was Roy, but everyone in town knew him as Razor, a nickname earned for his sharp tongue and even sharper blade. "Well, well," Razor drawled, his voice dripping with mockery. "Look who's come crawling back to River's Edge. Thought you boys had gotten too big for this little town." Marcus stepped forward, his broad frame cutting an imposing figure under the flickering fluorescent lights. He grabbed a bottle of water from the shelf and placed it on the counter with deliberate calmness. "Just here for some supplies," he said evenly, his voice steady and unbothered. Razor's eyes narrowed, clearly irked by Marcus's composure. "Funny thing, though," he said, leaning against the counter. "I heard you two went off to join the military. Thought you might have gotten yourselves blown to bits by now." The gang erupted into coarse laughter, but the tension in the room was palpable. Malik's hands curled into fists at his sides, the veins in his arms taut with barely contained restraint. "Thanks for your concern," Marcus said dryly, sliding a bill across the counter. "But we're still here." As they turned to leave, Razor called after them. "You think just 'cause you got some medals or whatever, you're untouchable now? This town don't forget where you come from, boy, and it don't forget who you are." Marcus paused at the door, his hand resting on the handle. Without looking back, he said, "Neither do we." Outside, the brothers walked in silence, the weight of the encounter settling between them. The sun had dipped below the horizon now, and the streetlights cast a dim, yellow glow over the cracked sidewalks. "That didn't take long," Malik muttered, his voice low. "They've always been like that," Marcus replied. "Small minds, big mouths. But it's different now," Malik said, his tone laced with frustration. "They don't know who we are, what we've done, they just see." He trailed off, but the unspoken word hung heavy in the air. Marcus stopped walking and turned to face his brother. "And that's all they'll ever see if we let them get under our skin." Malik nodded reluctantly, though the tension in his jaw remained. He'd always struggled with the burden of other people's perceptions, even as a kid. Marcus, on the other hand, had learned to compartmentalize But as they reached their grandmother's house, a modest single-story home at the edge of town, they realized the evening's troubles weren't over. A pickup truck idled in the driveway, its headlights cutting through the dark like a pair of watchful eyes. Leaning against the hood was Razor, flanked by two of his gang members. "Y'all didn't think it'd be that easy, did you?" Razor called out, a smug grin plastered across his face. Marcus and Malik exchanged a look, their postures straightening instinctively. They weren't just two brothers anymore. They were warriors, men who had faced down enemies far deadlier than Razor and his crew. But the brothers had also learned something else during their time as Navy SEALs. Sometimes the most dangerous battles aren't fought on foreign soil. "You've got about 5 seconds to get off this property, Marcusy," said, his voice low but firm. Razor chuckled, pulling a blade from his jacket and twirling it lazily between his fingers. "Or what? You gonna call the sheriff? Oh wait, forgot he's my uncle." Malik took a step forward, his fists clenched. "We're not kids anymore, Razor. You don't want to do this." The gang leader's grin widened, his eyes glinting with malice. "Oh, I do," he said, stepping closer. "I really do." And just like that, the fragile calm shattered. Before Marcus or Malik could react, a figure stepped out from the shadows near the porch. A tall, broad-shouldered man dressed in black tactical gear. His face was partially obscured by the brim of his hat, but his presence was unmistakably commanding. "Evening, gentlemen," the man said, his voice calm yet menacing. Razor froze, his knife hand faltering. His gang members shifted uncomfortably, their bravado draining in the face of this unexpected development. Marcus and Malik stared at the stranger, a flicker of recognition crossing their faces. "Who the hell are you?" Razor demanded, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. The man stepped forward, his boots crunching against the gravel. He tilted his hat back slightly, revealing a face hardened by years of combat. "You don't want to find out," he said, his tone ice-cold. The tension in the air was suffocating, and for a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, Razor lowered his blade and backed away, muttering curses under his breath. His gang followed suit, retreating to their truck and peeling off into the night. The stranger turned to the brothers, his expression unreadable. "You've got a storm coming," he said quietly. "Better be ready." And with that, he disappeared into the darkness, leaving Marcus and Malik standing in stunned silence, the weight of his warning settling over them like a heavy shroud. Black twins are challenged by racist gang, unaware they are the most decorated Navy SEALs, continued. The Carter brothers stood silently in the faint glow of their grandmother's porch light, the gravel driveway still vibrating from the retreating truck. The stranger's warning lingered in the air like the distant rumble of an approaching storm. Malik ran a hand over his closely cropped hair, his mind racing with unanswered questions. Marcus leaned against the porch railing, his expression unreadable, but his tightened jaw hinted at the battle. "No idea," Marcus replied, though his tone betrayed a flicker of unease. But he knew what he was walking into. Malik glanced at the darkened street. "And so did Razor. You think he'll stop?" Marcus's lips pressed into a thin line. "Not a chance." The screen door creaked open behind them, and the familiar scent of vanilla candles and cornbread wafted out. Their grandmother, Miss Evelyn Carter, stepped onto the porch, her silver hair glowing in the soft light. Though her frame had grown frail with age, her presence remained as steady and unyielding as the oak tree in her front yard. "Y'all just gonna stand out here all night, or are you coming in?" she asked, her voice warm but tinged with concern. Marcus forced a smile. "We didn't mean to keep you up, Grandma." "You didn't," she replied, her sharp eyes darting to the empty street. "But I know trouble when I smell it. Come inside before you catch a cold or worse." The brothers followed her into the house, the wooden floorboards creaking beneath their boots. The home was a sanctuary of sorts, filled with mismatched furniture, faded family photos, and the comforting hum of a ticking clock. On the mantel sat a framed picture of their parents. Marcus and Malik had been just 5 years old when they'd lost them to a car accident. It was Miss Evelyn who had raised them, teaching them everything she knew about strength, resilience, and the importance of standing tall in a world that often tried to knock them down. As they settled at the kitchen table, Miss Evelyn set down a tray of mugs filled with steaming herbal tea. She didn't ask what had happened, she rarely did. Instead, she gave them the space to speak when they were ready. "You ever think we should have stayed gone?" Malik asked suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was low, almost hesitant. Miss Evelyn paused, her hand hovering over the tea kettle. "Why would you say that, baby?" "Because nothing's changed here," Malik said, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "They still look at us like we don't belong, like we're just intruders." Marcus didn't say anything, but his steady gaze lingered on his brother. It wasn't the first time Malik had expressed doubt about coming back to River's Edge. In truth, Marcus had wondered the same thing more than once. But he couldn't ignore the pull of home, the sense of obligation to the place that had shaped them for better or worse. Miss Evelyn sat down across from them, her hands clasped around her mug. "You boys have been through things most people in this town can't even imagine," she said softly. "But don't you let their ignorance make you feel small. You came back here for a reason. Don't forget that." Malik looked down at his hands, his jaw tightening. "Sometimes I'm not sure what that reason is." "Then you keep looking," she said firmly. "And you don't stop until you find it." The room fell quiet, save for the distant chirping of crickets outside. Marcus finally spoke, his voice calm but resolute. "We're not going anywhere, Malik. Not because of them." Malik nodded, though the doubt in his eyes didn't completely fade. The next morning, the brothers decided to take a walk through the town, hoping to clear their heads. The streets were quieter than usual, the cold morning air adding an eerie stillness to River's Edge. As they passed the diner, they noticed a small group of older men sitting at an outdoor table, sipping coffee and trading stories. One of them, Mr. Wallace, waved them over. "Morning, boys," he said, his gravelly voice warm. "Haven't seen you two in years. Good to have you back." Marcus and Malik exchanged a glance before approaching the table. Mr. Wallace had been one of the few people in town who treated them with respect growing up. A retired school teacher, he'd often stayed after hours to help them with their homework or offer advice. "Morning, Mr. Wallace," Marcus said, shaking his hand. "It's good to see you." "Same here," he replied, though his expression turned serious. "Heard about the little commotion last night. You two all right?" "We're fine," Malik said quickly, but his tone lacked conviction. Mr. Wallace nodded slowly, his weathered face thoughtful. "This town's always had its problems," he admitted. "But don't let the likes of Razor and his lot get to you. They're cowards, plain and simple." "It's not just Razor," Marcus said. "It's the whole system here. The way people look at us, the whispers. It hasn't changed." Mr. Wallace leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. "No, it hasn't. But you two, what you've done, what..." The brothers thanked him and continued their walk, though his words stayed with them. They'd worked so hard to escape the limitations of their hometown, to carve out a life that was theirs and theirs alone. But being back in River's Edge felt like stepping into quicksand. Every move forward was met with resistance. That afternoon, while Marcus was helping Miss Evelyn with yard work, Malik decided to head to the community center. It had once been a safe haven for them as kids, a place where they could shoot hoops and escape the pressures of the outside world. But as he stepped inside, he was met with a wave of memories, some good, some not. The basketball court was empty, the echoes of his footsteps bouncing off the walls. He grabbed a ball from the rack and began dribbling, the familiar rhythm calming his restless mind. But his peace was short-lived. "Didn't think I'd find you here," a voice called out. Malik turned to see Razor leaning against the doorway, his arms crossed and a smug grin on his face. Two of his gang members flanked him, their expressions equally menacing. "What do you want?" Malik asked, his voice steady but edged with frustration. "Just came to talk," Razor said, though the way he stepped closer suggested otherwise. You and your brother have been stirring up a lot of attention. People are starting to wonder why you're really back." Malik's grip on the basketball tightened. "That's none of your business." Razor chuckled, shaking his head. "See, that's where you're wrong. Everything that happens in this town is my business." Malik took a step forward, his chest heaving with controlled anger. "You don't scare me, Razor." "You should be scared," Razor said, his grin fading. "Because you're not untouchable, no matter how many medals you've got. And if you're not careful, you're gonna find out the hard way." Before Malik could respond, Razor motioned for his men to follow him. "Enjoy your game," he said over his shoulder, his voice dripping with mockery. "While you still can." As the door slammed shut behind them, Malik stood frozen in the middle of the court, the ball slipping from his hands. His heart pounded. In his chest, not from fear, but from the growing realization that their presence in River's Edge was stirring something far more dangerous than old grudges. He knew then that Razor's threats weren't empty. And he knew they weren't just fighting for their own place in the town, they were fighting to protect the people they cared about. As he picked up the ball and began shooting again, one thought lingered in his mind. What's coming next? Black twins are challenged by a racist gang unaware they are the most decorated Navy SEALs. Continued. Malik stood in the center of the court, the orange basketball spinning idly in his hands. Razor's words clung to him like damp air, pressing down on his chest. The echo of the door slamming reverberated through the empty gym, but it wasn't the sound that made his hands tremble. It was the reminder that, for all the miles he and Marcus had traveled, some battles were harder to escape than others. He stared at the hoop, taking a deep breath. The rhythmic thud of the ball hitting the floor as he dribbled gave him something to focus on. He tried to remind himself of what Marcus always said: keep moving no matter how hard it gets, just keep moving. It was advice that had carried them through the darkest moments of their lives. But here, back in River's Edge, keeping calm felt like trying to stay afloat in a riptide. Meanwhile, Marcus was chopping firewood in Miss Evelyn's backyard. The rhythmic crack of the axe biting into the logs echoed through the cool afternoon air, each swing a release of the simmering tension that had been building since their arrival. He wiped the sweat from his brow, glancing at the woods that bordered their grandmother's property. The quiet of the forest reminded him of another place, another time, his first deployment as a Navy SEAL. He could almost hear the distant hum of a chopper and feel the weight of the gear strapped to his body. It was on that mission, deep in hostile territory, that he'd first realized just how much he relied on Malik. "Watch my six," Malik had said, his voice calm despite the chaos around them. And Marcus had. They always watched each other's backs. The sound of tires crunching gravel pulled Marcus from his thoughts. He turned to see a beat-up pickup truck parked at the edge of the property. A man climbed out. Marcus's grip on the axe tightened as Razor sauntered up, his hands in his pockets and that familiar smirk plastered on his face. "You got some nerve showing up here," Marcus said, his voice low and steady. Razor stopped a few feet away, his eyes gleaming with mock innocence. "Relax, I'm just here to talk." Marcus tilted his head slightly, sizing him up. "You don't talk, you threaten." Razor chuckled, taking a slow step forward. "Call it what you want, but I figured I'd give you boys a chance to leave before things get complicated." "Complicated?" Marcus repeated, his tone sharpening. "You see, not everyone in this town is thrilled about you two coming back," Razor said, shrugging. "People talk. They wonder why two Navy boys are suddenly so interested in sticking around a place like this." Marcus took a step closer, closing the gap between them. "We came back because this is home, and we're not going anywhere." Razor's smirk faltered for a split second before he regained his composure. "Suit yourself," he said, backing away toward his truck. "But don't say I didn't warn you." As Razor climbed into the truck and drove off, Marcus stood there for a moment, the weight of the encounter settling on his shoulders. He knew Razor wasn't just playing games. He was laying the groundwork for something bigger, something more dangerous. That evening, the brothers sat on the porch with Miss Evelyn, the warm glow of her kitchen light spilling onto the steps. Malik hadn't told Marcus about his encounter with Razor at the gym, but he could tell from his brother's demeanor that Razor had been up to something. "Grandma," Malik said, breaking the silence, "what do you think keeps people like Razor from moving on? Why do they cling so hard to their hate?" Miss Evelyn looked up from her knitting, her wise eyes meeting his. "Fear," she said simply. "Fear of losing the little power they think they have. People like that, they're empty inside, and they'll do whatever it takes to make themselves feel bigger, even if it means tearing others down." Malik nodded, her words resonating deeply. He thought back to the first time he'd felt the sting of that hate. He and Marcus had been 10 years old, playing basketball at the community center, when an older boy had shoved him to the ground and called him a name he didn't fully understand at the time. Marcus had been the one to step in, shoving the boy back and standing between him and Malik. "You don't touch my brother," he'd said, his voice trembling with anger but steady. It was the first time Malik had truly realized how much Marcus would sacrifice to protect him. And now, years later, Malik knew it was his turn to stand by Marcus, to fight, not just for themselves, but for the life they'd built and the people they cared about. The next day, the brothers decided to visit the old Veterans Hall on the outskirts of town. It was a modest building, its white paint faded and its flagpole slightly crooked, but it held a special place in their hearts. It was where they'd first heard stories of service and sacrifice, stories that had inspired them to join the Navy. Inside, the air smelled of leather and old wood. A few older men sat around a table, playing cards and laughing. One of them, Mr. Jenkins, looked up and smiled when he saw the twins. "Well, if it isn't the Carter boys," he said, setting his cards down. The brothers shook hands with the group, exchanging pleasantries. Mr. Jenkins, a Vietnam veteran, had always been a mentor to them, offering advice and encouragement when they'd needed it most. "We've missed you around here," Jenkins said, his voice warm. "How long are you planning to stay?" "For now, we're just trying to get settled," Marcus said. Jenkins nodded, his expression growing serious. "I heard about Razor causing trouble. You know you're welcome here any time if you need a place to regroup." "Thanks," Malik said, his gratitude genuine. "We appreciate that." As they talked, Jenkins pulled out an old photo album, flipping through pages of faded photographs from his time in the service. The brothers listened intently as he recounted stories of One story in particular struck a chord with Malik. Jenkins described a moment during a firefight when he'd been pinned down, certain he wouldn't make it out alive. But a fellow soldier, a man he barely knew, had risked everything to pull him to safety. "That kind of loyalty," Jenkins said, his voice thick with emotion, "is what keeps you going. It's what makes all the difference." Malik glanced at Marcus, the unspoken bond between them stronger than ever. As they left the Veterans Hall, the brothers noticed a figure leaning against their car. It was the same man from the night before, the one who'd stepped out of the shadows to confront Razor. "Looks like we're running into you a lot lately," Marcus said, his tone cautious but curious. The man straightened, his piercing gaze meeting theirs. "Name's Garrett," he said simply. "I'm with the Department of Defense." The brothers exchanged a glance, their curiosity piqued. "What's the DoD want with us?" Malik asked, his tone wary. Garrett's expression remained unreadable. "Not just you, the town. Let's just say Razor and his crew aren't as small-time as they seem." Marcus frowned, his instincts kicking in. "What are you saying?" Garrett leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a low tone. "I'm saying that this isn't just about petty racism or small-town grudges. There's something bigger at play here, something you two might be uniquely qualified to handle." Malik crossed his arms, his skepticism evident. "And why would we get involved?" Garrett's eyes hardened. "Because whether you like it or not, you're already in it. Razor and his gang aren't going to stop until they've pushed you out, or worse. And if you think this is just about the two of you, you're wrong." The weight of Garrett's words settled over them, The implications clear. This wasn't just about standing up to Razor. It was about protecting their home, their family, and the community that had shaped them. As Garrett walked away, disappearing into the shadows once more, Marcus and Malik stood in silence, the gravity of the situation sinking in. They didn't know what was coming, but one thing was certain. They weren't backing down, and for the first time in years they felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with facing the unknown. The wind howled through the darkened woods, shaking the brittle branches and carrying whispers of unease. Malik crouched low behind a tangle of bushes, his breathing steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. His eyes darted to Marcus, who signaled with a clenched fist, his jaw tight with determination. They were back where they felt most alive. The edge of a fight, shadows cloaking them like old friends. But this wasn't a foreign battlefield. This was their home, and the stakes were higher than ever. It had been only 3 days since their encounter with Garrett outside the Veterans Hall, but in that time, the tension in River's Edge had escalated to a boiling point. Razor's gang had grown bolder, their threats more direct. Graffiti scrawled on the front of Miss Evelyn's house, a slashed tire on the truck they used for errands, and then, this morning, the unthinkable. Malik clenched his fists as he recalled the sight of the smoldering wreckage. The community center, the place where he and Marcus had spent countless hours playing basketball as kids, had been set ablaze. Flames had devoured the gymnasium, leaving little more than blackened beams and ash. The firefighters had done what they could, but the damage was irreparable. And painted across the remaining wall in large, mocking letters was the message that sealed it all. Leave, or else. Marcus had found Malik standing in front of the wreckage, his face a mask of quiet fury. "They're not stopping," Malik had said, his voice low. "This isn't just about us anymore." Marcus had nodded, his own anger simmering beneath the surface. "Then it's time we stop playing defense." Now, under the cover of night, they found themselves deep in the woods near the edge of town. Garrett had tipped them off earlier in the day. Razor and his crew were planning something big. "Think of it as a command center," Garrett had said, sliding a folded map across the table. "They're using it to organize, stockpile supplies, and recruit more people to their cause. If you can shut it down, you'll cut off their power, but..." The mission wasn't as straightforward as it sounded. The compound was heavily guarded, and the gang's numbers had swelled in recent weeks. Marcus and Malik had spent hours strategizing, falling back into the unspoken rhythm they'd honed during their years as SEALs. Now, as they crept closer to the compound, the faint glow of floodlights came into view. The makeshift base was a patchwork of trailers and storage units surrounded by a high chain-link fence. Razor's gang was scattered throughout, some standing guard while others lounged around a bonfire, their laughter carrying on the wind. Malik's stomach churned at the sight of them, but he forced himself to focus. He and Marcus had faced worse odds before. "East side," Marcus whispered, pointing to a section of the fence partially obscured by a stack of crates. Malik nodded, his movements silent as they approached the weak point. He crouched low, pulling a pair of wire cutters from his pack. As he worked, Marcus kept watch, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The fence gave way with a quiet snap, and the brothers slipped through, their bodies pressed low to the ground. Every step brought them closer to the heart of the compound and the heart of the operation. Inside the base, the air was thick with the smell of gasoline and sweat. Malik and Marcus moved like ghosts, their training taking over. They bypassed a pair of guards stationed near a stack of crates, slipping into the shadows as they made their way toward the largest trailer in the center of the compound. According to Garrett, this was where Razor kept his most valuable information: plans, recruitment lists, and evidence of their larger operation. As they reached the trailer, Marcus signaled for Malik to cover him while he picked the lock. Malik's heart pounded as he scanned their surroundings, his senses heightened. He could hear the faint clink of the lockpick, the occasional burst of laughter from the bonfire, and the rustling of leaves in the distance. Finally, the lock gave way with a quiet click. Marcus pushed the door open, and they slipped inside. The interior of the trailer was cramped and cluttered, papers and maps scattered across a desk. Malik's eyes immediately went to a large bulletin board on the wall, covered in photographs, notes, and diagrams. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, his eyes scanning the board. Marcus moved to the desk, flipping through a stack of papers. "Looks like recruitment rosters, supply orders, maps of surrounding towns." Malik's stomach sank as he realized the scope of what they were looking at. This wasn't just a gang, they were building something much larger, much more dangerous. "Malik," Marcus said, his voice low. Malik turned to see Marcus holding up a photograph. It was a grainy image of the two of them, taken recently, scrawled. Across the bottom in red ink were the words, "Eliminate the threat." Before Malik could respond, the sound of a door slamming outside made them both freeze. The brothers moved quickly, extinguishing the light and slipping into the shadows of the trailer. Footsteps approached, heavy and deliberate, and a familiar voice broke the silence. "Check the perimeter," Razor barked. "I want every inch of this place locked down." Malik felt his chest tighten as he heard the unmistakable sound of a shotgun being cocked. Razor wasn't taking any chances. Marcus motioned for Malik to follow him toward the back of the trailer, where a small window provided their only means of escape. Malik climbed through first, landing softly on the They moved quickly, keeping low as they made their way back toward the fence. But as they rounded a corner, they came face to face with one of Razor's men. The guard's eyes widened in surprise, but he barely had time to react before Malik stepped forward, delivering a precise strike that sent him crumpling to the ground. "Let's move," Marcus whispered, pulling Malik along. The commotion had drawn attention, and shouts began to echo through the compound. The floodlights swung wildly as the gang scrambled to locate the intruders. By the time they reached the fence, the compound was in chaos. Razor's voice cut through the noise, barking orders and cursing the unknown threat. Malik and Marcus slipped through the hole in the fence, their breaths coming in sharp bursts as they sprinted into the cover of the woods. Back at Miss Evelyn's house, the brothers spread the documents and photographs they'd taken from the trailer across the kitchen table. Garrett arrived shortly after, his expression grim as he examined the evidence. "This is worse than I thought," Garrett said, running a hand through his hair. "They're not just a gang. They're part of a larger network, one that's been quietly spreading across the region." Malik's fists clenched as he stared at the photograph of him and Marcus, the words, "Eliminate the threat," burning. In his mind, "What do we do now?" Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. Garrett looked up, his eyes meeting theirs. "We take them down, but it won't be easy. They've got numbers, resources, and now, they know, you're on to them." The weight of his words settled over the room, but Malik felt a flicker of resolve deep within him. "We've faced worse," he said, his voice firm, "and we're not backing down." As the brothers prepared for what was to come, the night outside grew darker, the air heavy with the promise of an impending storm. And somewhere in the shadows, Razor was preparing too. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't have guessed, was just how far the brothers were willing to go to protect their home. As lightning flashed on the horizon, Malik and Marcus stood shoulder to shoulder, ready to face whatever came, next. The storm broke with a vengeance, rain hammering the ground and lightning splitting the night sky. Malik and Marcus crouched in the woods just outside Razor's compound, their gear soaked but their resolve unshaken. The evidence they'd gathered over the past week painted a damning picture. Razor wasn't just leading a gang of local thugs. He was part of a broader network tied to organized white supremacist groups operating across multiple states. Now, it was time to put an end to it. The plan was simple: infiltrate the compound one final time, gather indisputable evidence of Razor's larger connections, and use it to dismantle his operation. But as they moved closer to the perimeter, the faint sound of voices over a loudspeaker made them pause. Malik exchanged a glance with Marcus, his brow furrowed. "What the hell is that?" The answer came in the form of Razor's voice, booming through the storm. "Attention, River's Edge. You've been harboring traitors. Cowards who think they can stand against us. Razor's tone was laced with arrogance, each word dripping with malice. Marcus's jaw tightened. He's calling us out. Let's give him what he wants, Malik replied, his voice calm but steely. They moved quickly, their years of training kicking in as they navigated the muddy terrain. The compound was alive with activity. Guards patrolling with flashlights, dogs barking, and Razor's gang gathering near the bonfire, weapons in hand. In the center of it all stood Razor himself, his tall, imposing frame illuminated by the firelight. He held a megaphone in one hand and a rifle slung over his shoulder, his expression one of cruel delight. "Bring them out," Razor barked, and two of his men dragged a pair of figures into the clearing. The scene unfolded in slow motion. Miss Evelyn's frail form shook with fear, but her eyes burned with defiance. Garrett, bruised but still standing tall, met Razor's gaze with a look of quiet fury. "You think you can scare us?" Garrett spat, his voice carrying over the rain. "You're nothing but a coward hiding behind your goons." Razor's face twisted into a sneer. Big words for a man with no backup. He raised his megaphone again. "Come on out, twins, or their blood is on your hands." Marcus's hand tightened on his knife, his knuckles white. "We can't let them do this." "We won't," Malik said firmly, his mind racing. It was then that he noticed something, a glint of metal near Razor's wrist. He grabbed Marcus's arm, his eyes narrowing. "Look at his watch." Marcus squinted through the rain. It was a high-end tactical smartwatch, far too advanced for someone like Razor. "That's not just a watch," Malik muttered. "It's a tracker, maybe even a comms device." The pieces clicked into place. Razor wasn't just a pawn in this network. He was a direct link to the people funding and orchestrating it. And if Malik and Marcus could take him down, they'd have a chance to expose the entire operation. With renewed determination, the brothers moved into position, circling the compound and taking out guards one by one. Each step brought them closer to Razor, but the sight of Miss Evelyn and Garrett kept their adrenaline surging. Finally, they reached the edge of the clearing. Malik signaled to Marcus, who nodded. "On my mark," Malik whispered. Marcus gripped, his weapon tightly, his expression grim. 3, 2, 1. They moved as one, bursting into the clearing with precision and force. Malik took out the nearest guard with a swift strike, while Marcus disarmed another before he could fire. The gang erupted into chaos, their shouts drowned out by the storm. Razor spun around, his rifle raised, but Malik was faster. He tackled Razor to the ground, the two of them rolling through the mud as the rifle skidded out of reach. "You think you're tough, boy?" Razor snarled, throwing a punch that glanced off Malik's shoulder. Malik didn't respond. His focus was unshakable as he pinned Razor down, his knee pressing into the man's chest. Marcus freed Miss Evelyn and Garrett, his movements swift and efficient. "Get out of here," he shouted, helping them toward the edge of the clearing. But before they could reach safety, a deafening roar filled the air. A black SUV barreled into the clearing, its headlights blinding. The vehicle skidded to a halt and a group of heavily armed men stepped out, their faces obscured by masks. "Stand down," one of them barked, his voice authoritative and cold. Malik froze, his grip on Razor tightening. These weren't gang members. They were professionals, and they'd come to clean up Razor's mess. "You've got no idea who you're messing with," Razor hissed, a twisted grin spreading across his face, but Malik wasn't intimidated. He reached for Razor's watch, ripping it off his wrist and holding it up. "Then why don't you tell us?" Malik shot back, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. The masked men hesitated, their leader glancing at the watch. Malik saw the momentary flicker of recognition and fear in his eyes. "That's what I thought," Malik said, his tone triumphant. The next moments were a blur. Marcus fired a warning shot into the air, scattering Razor's gang. The masked men retreated to their SUV, their cleanup mission abandoned in the face of unexpected resistance. Malik and Marcus dragged Razor to his feet, his smug confidence replaced with panic. "You don't know what you're doing," Razor shouted, struggling against their grip. "You'll regret this." But the brothers didn't falter. They tied Razor's hands behind his back and marched him out of the compound, the rain washing away the blood and mud that clung to them. Back in town, the community gathered in stunned silence as Malik and Marcus delivered Razor to the sheriff's office. Miss Evelyn. The evidence they'd collected was enough to launch a federal investigation, and Razor's smartwatch provided the final piece of the puzzle. Within hours, federal agents arrived in River's Edge, their arrival signaling the beginning of the end for Razor's network. But the most shocking moment came when Malik and Marcus's identities were revealed. As the agents reviewed the brothers' military records, their jaws dropped. "You're SEALs," one of them stammered, his tone awestruck. "Not just SEALs," another agent corrected. "They're the most decorated operatives in the history of the program." The room fell silent as the weight of the revelation sank in. The news spread like wildfire, turning the tide in River's Edge. The community that had once been divided by fear and prejudice now rallied behind Malik and Marcus, their courage inspiring a newfound sense of unity. Razor and his accomplices faced swift justice, their operation dismantled piece by piece. And while the scars of their actions would linger, the town began to heal. For Malik and Marcus, the battle was far from over, but as they stood on the steps of the courthouse watching the rain give way to sunlight, they felt a sense of hope they hadn't known in years. "Think they'll ever stop underestimating us?" Marcus asked, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. Malik chuckled, his gaze steady. "Not as long as we keep proving them wrong." As the brothers walked away, the weight of their past battles lifted, replaced by the promise of a brighter future. The morning after Razor's arrest was one River's Edge would never forget. The storm had passed, and sunlight streamed through the cracks in the town's once-dimmed spirit. Federal agents swarmed the sheriff's office, cataloging the evidence Malik and Marcus had painstakingly gathered. Razor's smartwatch turned out to be a treasure trove, linking him directly to high-ranking members of a nationwide hate group. For Malik and Marcus, however, the victory didn't feel immediate. They stood outside the sheriff's office, their faces drawn with exhaustion. The adrenaline had drained from their bodies, leaving only the raw weight of what they had endured. "Never thought we'd come back here," Marcus murmured, his voice quiet. Malik glanced at his brother, his jaw tight. "Never thought we'd have to fight like this again," Marcus nodded. "But we did." "And we won," Malik added, a small, hard-earned smile breaking through. Consequences for the antagonist. Inside the sheriff's office, Razor sat in a holding cell, stripped of his bravado. The realization of his downfall had finally sunk in. No longer the untouchable leader of his gang, he was now just another criminal awaiting justice. Federal agents had wasted no time filing charges, racketeering, conspiracy, and hate crimes among them. The smartwatch provided damning evidence of his communications with powerful figures in the network, ensuring that his trial would be as public as his crimes. For the people of River's Edge, Razor's arrest symbolized more than just justice. It was a turning point, proof that hatred and intimidation would no longer rule their town. Healing the community. Later that day, the town square filled with people, some hesitant, others hopeful. The tension that had gripped River's Edge for years now felt like it was finally breaking apart. Miss Evelyn stood at the center, her voice carrying over the crowd as she addressed them. "For too long, fear has kept us apart," she said, her eyes sweeping across familiar faces. "But today we stand together, not as enemies but as neighbors." Her words were met with nods and murmurs of agreement. Even those who had been silent bystanders during Razor's reign of terror seemed to understand that change was inevitable. Malik and Marcus watched from the edge of the square, their presence a quiet but powerful reminder of what courage and perseverance could achieve. A moment of reflection. That evening, the brothers returned to Miss Evelyn's home, the place that had always been their sanctuary. They sat on the porch steps, their backs against the sturdy wooden railing as the sun dipped below the horizon. Miss Evelyn joined them, carrying 3 mugs of steaming tea. She handed one to each of them before settling into her rocking chair. "You boys did good," she said, her tone warm but firm. Malik stared into his mug, the steam rising in soft curls. "It doesn't feel like enough," he admitted. Miss Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "You took down a man who terrorized this town for years. You gave people hope. What more do you want?" Miss Evelyn reached out and placed a hand on his arm. "It's never truly over, child. But what you've done here, it matters. And it'll keep mattering as long as people remember." Her words settled over them like a comforting blanket, grounding them in the knowledge that their fight had meaning. Bridging divides in the days that followed, River's Edge began to transform. The sheriff, once complicit in Razor's intimidation tactics, resigned under public pressure. In his place, Garrett, who had spent years advocating for fairness and justice, was appointed as interim sheriff. Garrett wasted no time implementing reforms. He opened investigations into other gang-related activities and worked to rebuild trust between law enforcement and the community. Meanwhile, Miss Evelyn's small diner became a gathering place for open dialogue. People who had avoided each other for years now sat at the same tables, sharing meals and stories. Malik and Marcus often joined them, their presence a reminder of the resilience that had brought them this far. Processing the past one evening, Marcus found Malik in the attic of Miss Evelyn's house, sifting through an old box of photographs. "What are you doing up here?" Marcus asked, leaning against the doorway. Malik held up a photo, a black and white image of their father in his Navy uniform. "Just thinking." Marcus stepped closer, his gaze softening as he looked at the picture. "He'd be proud, you?" "No," Malik nodded, his throat tight. "Yeah, I keep wondering what he would have done, how he would have handled all this." Marcus placed a hand on his brother's shoulder. "He raised us to handle it, Malik, and we did. Together." The weight of Marcus's words settled in Malik's chest, bringing with it a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. Foreshadowing the future, as River's Edge began to heal, whispers of Malik and Marcus's actions spread beyond the town. Their identities as Navy SEALs, once a carefully guarded secret, had become public knowledge, sparking interest from reporters and veterans organizations alike. One afternoon, as they were repairing the fence around Miss Evelyn's property, a sleek black car pulled into the driveway. A tall man in a suit stepped out, his demeanor calm but purposeful. He extended a hand to Malik, his expression unreadable. "Lieutenant Commander Malik Johnson?" Malik exchanged a wary glance with Marcus before shaking the man's hand. "Who's asking?" The man smiled faintly. "Let's just say I represent an opportunity, one that might interest you and your brother." Marcus folded his arms, his brow furrowed. "What kind of opportunity?" The man handed Malik a business card. "A chance to take what you've done here and make a bigger impact. Nationally. Malik." And Marcus stared at the card, the weight of the offer sinking in. A hopeful note. That night, as they sat around Miss Evelyn's kitchen table, the brothers discussed the man's proposal. "I don't know," Malik said, running a hand through his hair. "Haven't we done enough?" Miss Evelyn set a plate of cookies in front of them, her expression thoughtful. "That's not the question, Malik. The question is whether you want to do more." Marcus leaned back in his chair, a small smile tugging at his lips. "We always said we wanted to make a difference. Maybe this is how we do it." Malik looked at his brother, then at Miss Evelyn. He thought of their father, of the lessons he'd instilled in them, and he thought of the people in River's Edge, the way they had come together in the wake of Razor's downfall. Finally, he nodded. "All right, let's see where this goes." Miss Evelyn beamed, her eyes shining with pride. "That's my boys." As they sat together, the weight of the past began to lift, replaced by the promise of what lay ahead. Malik and Marcus knew their journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long time they felt ready to face whatever came next. And as the first stars appeared in the night sky,